200,000 years ago, when we were kind of the same as we are now, physically, we were in a natural environment. There were no cities, and being in nature would have been just normal and desirable. And now when you walk around and you see birds and leaves, that's familiar. Your brain recognizes that and it's comfortable. This applies to so many things. I mean, I started to delve into the design world there, which is getting really interested in biophilia and biophilic design, as they call it. But yes, it's a very important element to thinking about how a city can be more appropriate for us as a species.
Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. Today we're talking about the outdoors and modern cities and why the outdoors are important in our modern lives. We're also going to learn about some success cases from around the world. Here to share some highlights from his new book is Chris Fitch, author of Wild Cities, Discovering New Ways of Living in the Modern Urban Jungle, which is an excellent and inspiring book. Hi, Chris. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Richard. Good to be here. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And I just want to start by saying I love this book. I mentioned before the show, I don't know anything about this topic. So I was coming in as someone that was just like a reader that probably not the person that would have picked this up at the bookstore. But it was really inspiring and really great to see how action was happening around the world. And some of the solutions are like so simple and so inspiring. We're going to cover some of the day. But yeah, I just really love the book.
Well, I mean, you say it's not something you know about, but you live in a city, right? You're a person who lives in a city like the majority of humans. So it's kind of for you, Richard.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. Well, then I'm the target audience. You get a +1 for that. I want to talk about kind of like one of the main aspects of the book is this term called biophilia, which I knew nothing about it, never heard it. Can you maybe describe what this is?
Yeah, it's a theory that it dates back a long way, but it was kind of popularized around the 80s by E.O. Wilson, who was a very famous figure in conservation and biodiversity, the whole ecological movement. And the basic premise of it is that all of us humans have this natural attraction to nature. And I'm sure, certainly for your audience, this is maybe kind of obvious. Like, we like bird song, we like nice views, we like being in natural places. And the theory goes is that this is a sort of an evolutionary element, hardwired into our DNA. And therefore it's not just something that applies to someone who maybe grew up in a more natural environment, outside of the city. But this is something that applies to everyone. And you see it in all sorts of scientific experiments when you test people out for, how do they react to, for example, birdsong or, the sound of water, or even things like having decoration inside of, let's say, a school or a hospital or a prison, maybe, where you have nature type designs. And you can see, people's, just to give some examples, like blood pressure can go down, anxiety can go down. All these ways in which being in nature is something that is positive and kind of therapeutic to humans, because that's the environment that we evolved in. 200,000 years ago, when we were kind of the same as we are now, physically, we were in a natural environment. There were no cities, and being in nature would have been just normal and desirable. And now when you walk around and you see birds and leaves, that's familiar. Your brain recognizes that and it's comfortable. This applies to so many things. I mean, I started to delve into the design world there, which is getting really interested in biophilia and biophilic design, as they call it. But yes, it's a very important element to thinking about how a city can be more appropriate for us as a species.
And then contrasting this kind of like long-term aspect of human evolution, you present a concept called homo urbanus, which kind of references how our lives have changed in the last 100 years. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, you won't find that in the scientific literature anywhere. But it's a play on the fact that since 2007, potentially May 2007, people have attempted to put an exact date on it. But since 2007, the urban human population has exceeded the rural one. I mean, if you go back to, say, the 60s, there was a global population of maybe sort of 3 billion people, and 2 of those 3 billion people would have been outside towns and cities, right? In the following 50 years, the rural population grew, but the urban population massively grew. And so you had the global population that sort of doubled, but the urban population had caught up. So many people had moved to urban environments that now, and I kind of remember this happening at the time. I was a student when I was a little bit of conversation about this, that there were now more people in cities. And since then, I mean, in terms of real numbers, the rural population has barely changed, whereas you've added another sort of 1.5 billion people who are living in towns and cities, and you've got cities that would have been, even just a few decades ago, kind of small towns and villages, and now giant metropolises. As a species, we are, we are an urban species now. We're sort of, you're looking at about 55%, and that's only going to go up. And I didn't approach this book thinking, I need to write some great manifesto for the future of mankind or anything like this. But it's really important that we think about this, because we are going to have the future of humanity living in cities. So basically the premise of the book is that if nature is important to us for our health and happiness, which I think the scientific literature shows pretty clearly that it is, then this is something that we need to think about. How do we get all of those people who live in urban environments? And, I'm someone who I really felt like I suffered from being in a city and not having nature around me. How do we expose people to that nature so that they get the benefits of it?
The book is a series of chapters on stories about individual cities that have tackled nature in different ways. And so what I'd like to do is maybe just ask you to share some of the things. There's hundreds or dozens of things that really resonated, but there's some things that I thought, this is really important. And I wonder, maybe we can start by talking about the Japanese study of stressed office workers going into nature. It led off the book, and I felt, that's just so obvious, but now there's scientific data that kind of demonstrates the impact of nature on people just like us.
Yeah. I sort of thought it would be fun to begin the book in a very, very urban place like Tokyo, which is by some long distance the kind of the biggest city in the world. But it's also, the Japanese government have been talking about this for decades now, of how can nature be used to help people who are stressed and kind of experiencing burnout from their professional lives. And they popularized what I'm sure you and everyone have heard of, which is like forest bathing, which is a little bit treated as something that's, this like ancient practice, but really it's been around since the 1980s. I don't in any way hold that anything against it. It's about encouraging people to leave the city and go out into nature. It's as simple as that. It sort of existed as a policy for about 20 years. And then in the early 2000s, there was some actual experimentation done to see what does this actually achieve. And various academics have researched this. But I went to Tokyo. I went to all the cities that are featured in the book, and I met Dr. Ching Li, who very kindly spent some time with me. He's a working medical doctor, but he took a huge interest in this question of how can being in and around nature be good for our human health. And so he led various studies where he was taking small groups of office workers, people with stressful city lives, and take them just for, a day or two out of the city. And then he would just monitor, he'd take things like blood samples, urine samples, and monitor, adrenaline and cortisol and, these stress hormones. And also the presence of what are called natural killer cells, which are sort of part of our immune response. And, you would see radical drops in these stress hormones, and the natural killer cells would go up. And all it took was a day or two of being away from the city. And even when you return to the city, you could get a few weeks, because he would then continue taking samples, and you would get a few weeks before the levels in people's bodies returned to how they were before they'd gone away. So it's just one example of kind of adding credibility to this idea that you can going into nature it's not just nice. It's not just like good for your mood, or like maybe I feel better, a bit more relaxed, which is true as well. But you can get a real like physiological impact on your body. And he did emphasize to me, look, this is something that maybe does require being away for a day or two. And if you're talking about urban forests, which is what I was, maybe somewhere you can visit inside the city for an hour or two, maybe as a passive thing. You're not even thinking, oh, this will be good for me. But you might just pass through for whatever reason. It's hard to see that it's quite as impactful, but there's certainly evidence that it has an impact on our health. I'm no doctor, but he is, and that's the message he was very keen to express.
I know anecdotally, I started having a coffee or a cup of tea on our patio with my wife most days, kind of in the
Very
middle of the
nice.
day, and just being outside in the backyard with the birds or the chipmunks screeching and being in nature. It does have like you're kind of stressed, and then I come back after a 10-minute break. I'm like, I feel really good, or I don't feel stressed at all. So I feel like that's something which, okay, there's research, but also just at least myself now, it may just be, maybe I may be expecting it, but I definitely feel just a little bit of time in nature does make me feel better.
Yeah.
Which is,
You have a little bit of nature around your home that you can escape into?
yeah, I'm lucky. I live a couple minutes from the biggest urban park, I think, in the world. So it's like
Okay,
tens of
yeah.
thousands of acres of
That's pretty great.
this river valley. So I'm pretty lucky. And then just our community is an old community, so lots of big trees and stuff. So I'm kind of lucky if I have that. But there's one part of the book that talks about biophobia. I think it was in Nairobi, and I'm lucky. I live in a city that really has a lot of nature. The study you just presented, people could go into nature, but there are people who live in cities that have no nature. And I was wondering if maybe you can talk a little bit about biophobia and, what you can do for people
Yeah.
that maybe can't get out to nature.
It's not a contradiction, but it doesn't entirely sit comfortably with the biophilia hypothesis, because the biophilia suggests that, or it proposes that all of us humans, because of our evolutionary history, have this natural attraction to being in nature. And then the work that's been done on what is kind of called biophobia is showing some evidence that the younger a person, when you're a child, if you're exposed to the more nature you're exposed to, the more comfortable you are with, I don't just want to keep broadly say nature, but let's say other living things. And we're talking like animals, birds, insects, creepy crawlies. I mean, there's a whole bunch of experiments to be done. I mean, some in Japan actually as well. In some academics in Tokyo did this, but it's been done in the US. It's been done in China. There was an interesting one done in Hungary. Different variations, but the basic premise of all these different studies, different experiments, was essentially finding out how comfortable are different people, like grown adults, with living around different wildlife. Certainly, how do they react? And you can do things like have a little measure on someone's hand and then show them pictures of spiders and snakes and things like this. And you can detect the electricity in their skin that reveals, how much are they sort of on edge when that happens. And you can definitely draw a correlation between people who say, yes, I grew up in an environment where there was a lot of nature and wildlife around me, and I spent a lot of my time outdoors, and them having a lower, gut reaction, and in many cases, a spoken sort of preference to say, yes, I'm more comfortable to be around other living creatures than people who say, no, I more grew up in a city. I was more of an indoors kid. It kind of makes sense in a way. It's all of us in many parts of our lives being more comfortable with things that we were exposed to when young. But the way that biophobia is talked about, it kind of recognizes that a lot of people now, and probably increasingly so, don't grow up in an environment where they are surrounded by, not surrounded by even, but have almost any exposure to non-human life. Maybe a pet. I mean, that could be the extent of it. And then growing up with something of a phobia to any wildlife around them, and so this is part of it. This is something that I would certainly argue. It would be nice for more people to be comfortable with understanding. You're an organic being like all of these other creatures, and yes, there are some things, depending where you are in the world, there are some things you need to be careful of, but it's not something that you need to freak out or panic just because, you see a spider or something, and, acknowledgements to people in Australia or wherever where spiders are genuinely deadly things. But for a lot of the world, you don't need to freak out. And people don't, if that's just not part of their world, then why would they know that? So they just go straight to fear, which I totally understand. But I feel like it's a good aspiration to help people with that.
The book has lots of interesting examples of cities bringing nature back into the city, from wildlife corridors in Medellín to, taking back streets in Barcelona. One that really interested me, well, they all interested me, but one that I found really compelling was this green building revolution in Singapore, because the way it was described in the book, and then going to look at these buildings, where this is not a green building like an LEED building where it's energy efficient. It's actually, the canopy of the building is plants. It was just like so interesting. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about this, as well as like how far can this go? Singapore is a very unique climate. Can this kind of go to any temperate climate, or does it have to be kind of these warm climates with high rainfall?
I mean, the short answer is it can be kind of anywhere. It's going to depend the natural vegetation of wherever you are in the world. It's going to vary, of course. And yeah, Singapore, very tropical region of the planet. And so what you end up are these like incredible scenes of like tropical plant life all over buildings. And yeah, just to explain the story that you're talking about there, that Singapore, quite early on in its history, since becoming independent, kind of the mid 20th century, really lent into this, urban nature vibe, and it became more of a concrete policy. And probably a lot of people have heard of the idea of Singapore as a city in a garden is what it was, and then it became city in nature. I think I've skipped there was another stage along the way, but yeah, they've sort of gone more and more, like deeper and deeper into this urban nature concept. And some of it is branding, but a lot of it is pretty genuine, because when you have, let's say, greenery on the rooftop of your building, it's not just good for biodiversity, helping out native birds and insects and so on, but it can be really good insulation for preventing your building from getting really hot in the day, and that can apply anywhere in the world, and potentially the opposite direction. It can keep your building warm if you're in a cooler environment. The same goes for a green wall, that you can have greenery down the side of a building. And there's an incredible building that I had the privilege to visit when I was there in Singapore, called Oasia, which it's a pretty standard like luxury hotel, and they've got office facilities and so on in there as well. If even just seeing it, this incredible green like waterfall that looks like it's cascading all the way down. And it does score pretty high for biodiversity because you get a lot of insects and native birds that go and hang out around this building. But that combined with some sort of quite clever design with the way that they get the wind to kind of funnel through the building, they get to run the air conditioning in this building super, super low, which for Singapore, which is very hot, very humid, very high energy bills when it comes to air conditioning, and is sort of an example of what the rest of the world might come to look like by the end of the century, let's say, as climate change makes the world sort of warmer and possibly more humid. They're able to run really low energy bills, and it's not just, oh, it looks nice, which it does, and it's amazing for me as a bit of a romantic of this kind of thing to walk around and see like buildings covered in greenery. But they're doing it for economic reasons as well. And there's a scheme which is I'm not entirely sure of the status right now, but it's kind of on and off depending on how much incentive the government feels is necessary. But it's called Skyrise Greenery. And when it's active, basically you can, if you're the owner of a building, you can go to the government and say, okay, I'm interested in putting a green roof or a green wall on my structure. And if you're approved, the government will pay up to 50% of the costs for what it would cost you to have this sort of initial investment, because in many cases there is, the need to install a fair amount of equipment, let's say, on your building. But, you're obviously thinking, oh, I'm going to have lower bills in the future. So it's an investment that should pay off. And the government is encouraging this. They have people come to visit all the time from around the world to say, look, this is how we do it. And a lot of these techniques that we've used can be applied in all different cities. So they are, without a doubt, the world leader in this. And they had this policy which basically aimed for 100% replication of, if you imagine the ground area of a building, the idea is you have to create within the structure enough greenery that it would recoup the surface area of the building as if the building wasn't there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it became a policy that you have to achieve at least 100%, as in you have to replicate the amount of greenery that you essentially replaced by putting a building here. But you get some that go way past 100%. You can, and Oasia, the skyscraper I referenced, they go up to like 1,000%. It's like 10 times the amount of greenery. You can debate how much vertical greenery is useful versus horizontal, but in terms of pure numbers, you've got at least 10 times more greenery than there would have been if the building wasn't there. And that, I don't know, it's a remarkable way of thinking. And the more people are aware of this as a concept, and the more that architects and designers are experimenting with this as an idea, to say that buildings don't have to be just grey or glass, which, is, again, if you're in a hot part of the world and you're heating these buildings up in a way that you have to use insane amounts of energy to cool them down, think about a green wall. There's ways that we can use nature, and we can enjoy the nature that's there as well.
A big part of the stories in the book and even the Oasia building is the impact on biodiversity, where I can't remember the numbers, but it showed a huge impact in terms of the biodiversity. And there was other examples of just rooftop gardens. And I was wondering if you can explain for a regular human, why would it matter to them that the place they live is more biodiverse?
I'll make the argument based on my perspective, which is that biodiversity is good because I want more nature around me. The more biodiversity you have, the more resilience you have, basically, to an ecosystem, to an environment that if we don't know what's going to happen. You can have changes in temperature. You can have diseases that sweep through an environment. And the more biodiversity you have, the more resilience you have. And the way I explain it to some people who aren't very familiar with this is thinking like maybe like a financial portfolio that you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. Like the more diverse your portfolio is, the more resilience you're going to have to upheaval in a financial situation. And it's kind of the same in the ecological world. You want that diversity and you want that resilience in order to protect the nature that's there, and ensure that it lasts for the future. So if someone comes to me and says, well, I don't actually care about nature, then there's a whole separate conversation of like, why should you be interested in having nature around you that goes back to the biophilia stuff. But that's the basic premise of like why biodiversity is good. And it became something of a focal point for me, because as you're saying, you can talk about greenery, a green city, a green building. There are so many ways to interpret that. It could be that you have really good recycling, or you have really lots of low energy light bulbs or something like this. And sometimes these different metrics kind of get bundled up together, and it can be quite complicated to understand what are we actually talking about here. So I was really focusing on ecology and biodiversity, and how do we enhance ecology and biodiversity within the urban environment, and put the other ones to the side somewhat.
I was really inspired with the chapter on Barcelona. And there's two things that really inspired me. The first was how they'd really tackled this idea of walkable and walking cities. Can you share a bit about what they've done?
The funny thing about Barcelona is they really shouldn't need to do anything, really, because it's a really, even compared to the rest of Europe, it's a really dense city. And the majority of journeys that take place in Barcelona are done on foot, or maybe some slither of that will be with a bicycle. But it's I think it's maybe 8 kilometers across the city center. It's not. That's 5 miles for people who don't know kilometers. It's not a big city, and it's quite easy to get around. It's because it's an old medieval city, and then it had this great expansion in the 19th century, beyond the kind of traditional medieval walls. But even that expansion, even though it became many times bigger, it's still nothing like the kind of sprawl that you see in North America and Australia and other parts of the world that had a lot more space to expand into, and were designed at a time when it was all about the car. The problem Barcelona's had is they sort of retrofitted it to fit cars in. And lots of Europe had a similar story, where you had a very dense city, and then at some point people said, well, it's all about cars, so we need to destroy the existing urban fabric, because we need to have these great big highways. And a lot of what has happened in the last couple of decades is been reversing that, because actually you get to a point where you realize, well, the motor vehicle based model has limitations. You can only have so many cars on the road at one time. There's only room to park a certain number of vehicles. You're worrying about air pollution and noise pollution. And actually, it would just be easier for everyone involved if we go back to the way that the city was designed, let's say a century ago, and focus on having these like big public pedestrian areas, which can be, well, for my opinion, a bit more pleasant than having cars racing around everywhere. So Barcelona, yes, lots of things they've done. Pull down some sort of big flyways that were constructed, put in a big giant public park instead. That's very nice. There's these sort of cross city walk highways, you could perhaps think of them, with the idea that if you're in point A and you want to get to point B and you want to walk it and it's only a few kilometers, that you have a kind of an easy path to do that. And the idea is that you are as obstructed as little as possible by the traffic that still exists in the city, because you're not getting rid of it completely. You're just deprioritizing it. And then the thing that Barcelona most got well known for was this concept of, well, in English, it's called superblocks, which is having distinct neighborhoods where you're basically disincentivizing people from driving through them. You make it very difficult to essentially drive through where someone else lives. It's not like you can't have a car, but if you're going into the neighborhood, as well as less space, less speed, there's more advantage given to pedestrians, but also you enter. And, if you're an ambulance, you're a delivery vehicle, fine, you've got something to do. You can drop off and you can leave. But it's to stop people doing that thing where they cut through streets all the time, which I'm sure we're all familiar with wherever we live in the world. The idea of places where people live becoming the route that someone else is using to get to work or to get home. And it's basically saying, no, this is actually a neighborhood. People live here. There's a school. There's a children's play area. There's people who want to sit outside and have coffee. It's about the quality of life, lower air pollution, yes, lower noise pollution, and coming up with schemes in Barcelona. Certainly, there's dig a new tunnel was one solution. Finding ways to channel the traffic, which is generally people outside the city coming in, like commuting in. The people who live in the city generally don't have cars. It's the commuters who are causing the traffic. Understanding, okay, this is the way that we're going to handle this flow of traffic so that it has the least impact as possible on the people who actually live in the city and at present, or a decade or so ago before all this started, had to put up with the consequences. And it's a model, the superblock model. It's in lots of cities now, especially in Europe, but expanding beyond that. And it's an opportunity again to think about, what should a city look like? Should a city be lots of roads? Because in many cases, that can be the biggest impediment to a lot of what we want to do. If you want to make a city wilder and more ecological, focusing on space to walk around might seem a little bit like it doesn't fit with the ecology side, but in many ways, it completely overlaps. That you can have huge, I think something like 60% of the Barcelona urban landscape was the number that was told to me. 60% was used for handling cars, roads, parking spaces, and so on. But as I said, people who live in the city, they don't, it's a small percent who actually have a car. So you just reduce that percent of the city that is focusing on space for cars. Yes, you can walk and cycle everywhere, but also you can start to think about everything else that we've talked about in terms of urban forests, pocket parks, green corridors, all the different ways that you might think about inviting nature back into the city.
Another great example from Barcelona, and as a parent, this is something that kind of blew me away, was this idea of the BC bus or Beaky bus. I'm not sure.
The BC bus.
BC
well,
bus.
It depends where in the world because it gets translated into different languages.
Can you just talk about this? Because I feel like every parent who hears this is going to want to start doing it for their school run, and like in nice weather, just ditch the car or ditch the bus.
So I joined a BC bus when I was there in Barcelona, but it's not a Barcelona thing. It kind of bounced around different places, from kind of Belgium, Colombia. Definitely there's been a movement in the US that gave it a lot of publicity as well. But basically it's about thinking of, how do you describe it? Like the school bus, the idea of a bunch of kids going to school together, at the same time, but not on a bus, but in a group of cyclists together. And so it works in the same way that a school bus would, where you have a schedule. Different places will have different systems, different days of the week when it runs, but just as a broad explanation, you have a schedule. Like it will leave this neighborhood or this square in the city at this time, and maybe there's I don't know, a handful, like 3, 4 parents and their kids. It could be on a scooter, a skateboard, a little 3-wheel bicycle, or a tricycle, isn't it? And then they follow a set route, and the parents who are going to the same, kids are going to the same school, they know that it's coming. They know where they have to be to get on the bus. This is air quotes. And as the group goes past, everybody joins in. And it's so, it's really wonderful. I actually got quite emotional. I'm not even a parent, but it became such a joyous occasion to go to school. These are kids going to school, but there's music playing, and people are, kids are catching up with their friends, and some of them stay close to their parents. Some of them don't want to be seen anywhere near their parents. They go off to the front and, act like they're leading the way. And it's this real beautiful movement of getting the kids safely to the school in a really fun way, in a way that would not be you can imagine no parent would want to do this if it was just them and the kid and they were there in the traffic. But because it's an organized thing, you've got a group of, by the end, 100 maybe, people moving together. And then you have volunteers who are going ahead and stopping the traffic coming in from different roads. So you're completely safe. There's no traffic on the roads. And so the parents can relax. And I sort of timed this group of cyclists as they went past, and it was a minute maybe. And then the traffic returns to normal. So I would not believe it if someone said, oh no, this is such an obstruction to the way the city works, because it's a minute. And with that, you're allowing all these kids to safely get to school in a healthy way. There's just so many upsides to it. So perhaps people listening will know of a BT bus somewhere near them, or have a similar system that isn't branded in the same way. But it was certainly a beautiful way to, again, imagine how a city can be different from the classic design.
Chris, people talk about rewilding and greening as a luxury for the rich, but your book makes a really compelling argument that this is important for everyone, for kind of all humans, and especially people living in urban environments. Can you talk more about this, please?
My first argument would simply be it's a moral question, and that all of us deserve this same sort of free access to nature. Everybody deserves that, and it shouldn't be. Again, this comes back to the core of the book. If you live in a city, but you want the benefits, the health and happiness benefits, the physical and mental health benefits that come from being in nature, you shouldn't be required to spend a fortune flying away to some remote corner of the planet in order to find that. It should be, to an extent that's realistic, on your doorstep. There's also a lot of evidence that it's actually the most sort of disadvantaged communities who have the most to gain. There have been various experiments or observational studies that have shown that when you increase the greenery in a neighborhood, for example, it is the people on the lowest incomes who demonstrate the greatest benefits from that. You think about something like childhood development or sort of education scores. Again, you get the greatest jumps in the neighborhoods in which the people with the lowest incomes and lowest wealth live, which traditionally are the areas by and large which have the least nature in them. So for me, the main point is the morality question of, I feel like everybody just has this basic right to have nature near them, but there are lots of other arguments you can make if that's not enough for you. And yeah, I feel like all of us deserve to be able to engage with the natural world. It's part of our heritage, wherever you live. And living in a city certainly should not be an impediment to that.
And I think one other thing is a lot of these projects that are described, they're not super expensive. They're not super complex. Like there's iterative, small scale solutions that can have an enormous effect on people. And yeah, it's almost just, this should almost be on every municipality's radar of what can we do to make our citizens healthier and happier. And I'm sure there are lots of simple solutions for all different city types. Chris, thanks for coming on the show. It's been great to talk about your book some more. And just to, have this interesting discussion.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's wonderful. I love to talk about this, as you can probably tell. So thanks for having me on.
Now, where can people find your book? It's, once again, Wild Cities, Discovering New Ways of Living in the Modern Urban Jungle. What date does it come out?
It comes out on November 18th in the US and Canada. It's already out now if you are in the UK, or if you're in Australia and New Zealand. You can hopefully find it at your local bookstore or various, wherever you go to get your books. And if you want to know more information, Instagram is a good option. I've got a special account for it. It's wildcities.book. Or go to chrisfitch.org, where you can contact me and see other things that I've done.
Excellent. So yeah, go to your local bookstore. If they don't have it, ask them for it. And once again, everyone, thanks for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Bye-bye. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.